Hello and welcome to this episode of Developer-Led, the show where we explore how modern companies build and distribute developer products. My interview partner today is Jana Iris. Jana is one of the OGs in developer community building. As employee number 10 at HashiCorp, she has scaled one of the most iconic communities from 1 to millions of developers. Furthermore, she was involved in building developer communities at companies like Relic, Relic, and Sourcegraph. Starting in 2022, she angel invested in over 10 early-stage startups, mostly in the open source and DevTool space, until she turned her side project into a full-time profession and joined TQ Ventures, a small but mighty firm that raised $500 million. Jana, I'm so excited to have you here today. To get started, can you tell us how you stumbled into the world of developer communities?
Jonathan, I'm so honored. Pleasure to be your first host or first guest. I've been doing community management, community development since my first startup. I got really lucky. I started working at this company called Engine Yard, and I moved to San Francisco in 2008. And it was kind of like Engine Yard was a Ruby on Rails hosting platform. And we hosted the largest Ruby on Rails websites at the time. So GitHub, New Relic, Bleacher Report, Groupon. And we did a lot for the open source community. So we were just doing things that felt naturally, right? So back then there wasn't really a playbook on how to build developer communities. So we're like, oh, hey, we think to help kind of push the Ruby on Rails ecosystem forward, we should probably sponsor open source projects and contributors. Hey, maybe it would be beneficial if we hired open source contributors and paid them full time to work on Rubinius and Rails. Maybe it would be helpful if we used our amazing office. We were in the old Yahoo office on 3rd Street in Soma in San Francisco. We're maybe we should host meetups and just do pizza and beer, right? So I think it was just, we started just naturally doing the things that I now kind of have come to is a part of how the playbook. But it was just things that were this just feels right to connect people in this way.
That's cool to hear that you kind of naturally really stumbled into that. If you compare it to how companies build communities today, what would you say? How has the role of developer communities changed over the last 10 years that you have been doing this?
Yeah, I mean, it's really incredible to see companies embrace that. I had a call yesterday with a founder where we were talking about bottoms up marketing and being community led and product led. And when I started up, right, it was still kind of, we had a sales team and it was still very, you find the decision maker and you find the CTO and the VP of engineering, and then you convince them to buy your product, and then you hope, right, that they have enough say that the developers adopt it. But what we found pretty early on, right, or at least I found my career early on, that it's it's really the developers. If they love a tool, product, service, they will adopt it. And that's why community, right, you've seen community rise, and you've seen this bottoms up marketing really gain traction. When I started at HashiCorp, right, we were one of the, Red Hat leads the way in building a business for open source. You have Mongo, right? You have some kind of early companies that we were able to look at, Basho for React, Docker. But I think HashiCorp was one of the first really to successfully penetrate the open source community and then build a successful revenue generating business on top of that.
All right. And you already mentioned that you had a call with a founder yesterday. So if a founder comes to you and asks you, hey, Anna, how do I build a developer community? What's usually the playbook or the answer that you give to them?
Well, I ask them how much time they have. And then it was never one thing, right? People are always Jana, it was the one thing that really kind of pushed, right, the growth in the HashiCorp community. I'll use them as an example. And it wasn't one thing, right? We were just always so consistent. We never stopped. So from the beginning, right, community was in our ethos. So Mitchell and Armand, before any of us were there, were already doing community building. Mitchell always talked about when he open sourced Vagrant, which was HashiCorp's first project, we had no downloads. And so what he started to do was he started speaking at meetups, and he started blogging, and he started responding to people on Twitter and on GitHub, and just started being more public and about the work and his ideas and ethos around the project. And then he started to get conference talks, right? Back then he wasn't well known, so he could speak at a meetup. And then slowly, right, he started getting, and so he saw the numbers increase. So already we're like, okay, we saw how Vagrant took off. So that was in our ethos. So I was the second non-technical business hire and like the first community person. And so what was really nice is I didn't have to fight for every dollar, right? So I didn't have to be like, okay, community, like they already knew community is important. And what was really nice is all of us in the early days were community builders, right? So HashiCorp was a very engineering heavy company. But all the engineers were community builders, right? We were all encouraged, like whenever I would set up trainings, right? Full day in-person trainings, our engineers would staff those. Or if we needed content, right? The engineers would write the content, or the engineers would do the documentation, or engineers would respond on GitHub issues. And so like we were all helping build the community, and we were very consistent. So there's I believe, and I wrote a blog post about this, but it took me a really long time to kind of articulate, but I believe that there's 5 pillars to building developer communities. And the top 2 that that I always believe are the first important ones it's education, right? Like, for example, are you introducing a new way of working? Then that requires lots of documentation, tutorials, videos, guides, your manifesto. For example, when we open source Terraform, infrastructure as code wasn't a concept yet. What wasn't a widely accepted engineering way of working. And Mitchell and Armand had to give over 40 talks in the first 2 years of what infrastructure as code was, right? So the education piece, and then I think like the peer-to-peer knowledge sharing is really important, right? So first it's like, you can only talk about yourself so much. And it's really like, for example, when we did the first HashiConf in 2015, we had 350 people there. It was the first time we'd ever brought our community together. And we had, for example, Capital One spoke on stage of how they were using Vault in production. And that was huge, right? That was a really big thing for us, where people are like, oh, okay, if this large bank is trusting HashiCorp and trusting Vault. So that peer-to-peer validation, right? And seeing other, like for example, Stripe, right? They gave a talk about how they were using Console. And so this like validation from like your peers is what helps then push kind of the adoption of things. And yeah, from the beginning, we just never stopped. Like we just kept building. We would launch our education program, our ambassador, our core contributor program, our hub program, our user conference program. But we always kept those 5 pillars in mind, right? And never just, and we're always just so consistent, right? Like we were always like, we need to be pragmatic and professional, and people need to trust us, right? We need to build developer trust, and we need to like build these programs based on those pillars and be consistent. And we were. It's a long-winded answer.
Yeah. This article is definitely great. It was actually the first piece that I read from you. I will definitely link it somewhere in the show notes.
I think the other pillar that's really important is design with empathy. It's something that like people. I actually had a call yesterday with Paul Hensey, an old colleague. He used to be VP of engineering and our Terraform contributor, and we were talking a lot about like empathy. And I think that's something we try to do as well. And I'm not talking about, when I say design with empathy, I'm not talking about like logos and colors. I'm also talking about keeping the other person in mind. Like sometimes we forget that there's a human on the other end of whatever experience. Like for example, you send an email. Communicate with that person like a human, right? Don't use a lot of marketing jargon and have it overly designed that it's hard to read, right? So we always try to communicate with our community is like matter of fact, professional, empathetic, right? And always treated people with respect. And I think that went a really long way. So that was the third pillar, and there's others, but yeah, link to the article.
How you put it, it almost sounds like there's not really a playbook for building a community, but it's rather that you have to be like naturally born to be a community builder and rather like follow a certain set of values with your team. Do you think there's like things that you can do to yeah, just help your team and foster this kind of community building mindset?
Yeah. I think there's things you can learn, right? So I do think there's a playbook to building communities, but I think the best community builders I've met are ones that understand it, but apply parts of the playbook to their audience, right? Each audience is a bit different in terms of kind of their needs, their pain points, where they communicate, how they want to interact. So I always find that the best community builders and DevRel leaders take pieces of the playbook. And sometimes, right, you can launch programs too soon. Like, for example, if you don't have an engaged community, it's probably too early to launch like an ambassador program, right? Because it's like, who's going to want to be a part of your ambassador program if they don't quite aren't attached yet to like your mission, what you're building. So there's sometimes, right, people just take the playbook and they're like, okay, well, here's our forum. And then all of a sudden you see crickets in your forum, or here's our ambassador program, and you don't have a good reception to it because people aren't fully committed yet to kind of the mission of what you're building.
As a follow-up question to that, what do you think is one thing that most people get wrong about developer community building?
That's a really lovely question. I mean, I've worked at 6 early stage startups, so I've definitely made my share of mistakes. Just overall, I think the startup, I have so much empathy for the startup founder journey and admiration, right? I never had the guts to start my own thing, and it's a lot, right? I mean, like if you think about in the last 3 years, right, we had like just the amount that gets thrown at you, right? Like a global pandemic and the war in Ukraine and Silicon Valley Bank meltdown. And so, so there's just so much that you have to think about as a founder. But I think at the end of the day, it's the most important is to build developer trust, right? So you as a founder and leaders have pressure, right? You have pressure sometimes from your investors to show results, or right, like you're getting pressure to start monetizing. And I think it takes a long time to build developer trust, and you can in a second kind of destroy it. And so I think the way I've seen kind of companies make mistakes is they start being a bit short-sighted, right? So they're like, hey, I start pushing sales and emails and trying to convert leads, which you start being a bit more transactional with people, and you're not you kind of stop treating them like individual humans, which I think hurts kind of the long game, which is community, which is building community and building these like deep connections with kind of what you're like with your product. I try to do a lot of like a self-reflection, like on my personal life and work. And it's been really nice because I was mostly working for startups kind of in the bull market. And even though HashiCorp, like when we raised our Series A, we asked investors to give us 2 years to really kind of penetrate the open source before we had to start thinking about monetization. And then I also mentioned right earlier that the founders just deeply understood the value of community. So we had time, and I didn't have to, from the early days, kind of tie everything to the business goals. And I think that's kind of a mistake I made, right? Like I should have from the early days, even though I didn't have to, okay, what are our company goals, and make sure the programs I was doing and the work I was doing was more closely integrated to the company and the business goals. And I think that I would have been set up a lot better for success, like long term, right? Like I still talk about that first HashiConf, right? We had 350 people there, and I was able to kind of watch, right? And I didn't actually track it, but it's like, hey, I knew those 350 people, they became our largest customers, right? Capital One years later became a $10 million a year deal. They became core contributors, ambassadors, employees, but I never kind of tracked that. And there was a lot of things that I didn't. So I couldn't be like, hey, 7 years later, this was the impact of these different programs. And I think that I wish I had done that. And so that's something I tell a lot of founders now.
Why do you wish you would have done that? Because it sounds like you did an amazing job on that. So those customers or those early community members indeed turned into big customers. And it seems like you also had the backing of the founders, right? So is it like rather just for like personal track record, or do you think you would actually do a better job on community building if you can tie it back to metrics?
Yeah, I think it would at some point, right? The company, we shifted, right? We hired more leaders that were focused on enterprise, and we had to, right? We had to be like, okay, now let's figure out how to build, a sustainable large business. And so there were times, right, where my job became more challenging. So the first few years, it was just a given. But of course, right, I was 10 people or 50 people or 100 people reporting to Mitchell and Armand, or like 1 degree away from them, right? I was able to talk, but at some point, right, we were a 400-person company, and you hired more people, right? And some folks that had different business goals that they had to hit. And so it became harder and harder to advocate for resources and budget. But if I had and again, right, I didn't know, I was 28 when I joined, 29. So so I just didn't know these things, but that's kind of something any community leader or founder I talk to is like, start measuring and tracking just the early days, right? It doesn't seem like it now, but the 7 years I was at HashiCorp went by so fast, right? I mean, it takes 10 years to build a successful business, but like it also goes by really quickly. So again, I wish I had just kind of set up like the metrics and measuring early days, that then as more leaders came in, I could have been like, hey, the first 2 years, this was the impact of all of my programs. I just didn't have that data set.
Yeah, okay, that's fair. Totally different topic. What would you say is a controversial view that you have on community that most people won't agree with?
That's a really good question. I think I feel like I'm being challenged a bit as I'm talking to a lot of founders, and we're in this down market right now where I've been a community builder my whole career, but now I'm almost, do we put a little bit less value, right? Like is at some point, does a company have to shift from being a bottoms up company to right to like more of a top, like, do you have to have like sales, and do you also have to do like the enterprise top down, and do you kind of have to like kind of switch as a company? And that's something I'm kind of like grappling with, of like, when does that shift happen? And especially right now, right? Like I'm talking to founders that maybe have a year of runway left, and I'm like, okay, well, how important is long game community building versus your business surviving? So I think that's something, I don't know if it's a controversial thing, but it's something that I'm personally grappling with as I'm having these kind of like brainstorming discussions, and it's something I don't have the answer to yet, but it's something that's kind of challenging my own thought process of like the importance and value of community. Or maybe are expanding our view of what community means, right? Or I also think community includes customers. So maybe some of the program spend and thought should go around, okay, kind of the prospects or the current customers, and upselling current customers and setting up user feedback programs. So maybe kind of expanding what we think, like who fits into kind of our view of like community for a company. Because at HashiCorp, right, we had kind of like the open source community, and then we had our customers. And I actually think it all should have been just one thing.
Yeah. I also see that their definition of community is more and more changing. And these days, many companies define everyone who has some sort of interaction with them, be it a customer, be it ex-employees, be it people just, for example, contributing to an open source project. Like, they define everything as community. And I feel like this is also where the whole community space is more and more moving. So it's like everything that happens within and around a company. How do you kind of see the future of developer communities evolving over the next 5 years, 10 years?
I love looking at history, right? Like, we've been open sourcing code since the 50s. And developer communities always existed, right? We were doing bulletin boards and IRC channels. And so it's like, there's always been developer communities, right? So that's why I think like people are always like trying to like reinvent the wheel. But at the end of the day, people need to solve complex problems and need tools that help them solve that. And we're humans that want human connection. And so I think kind of like the core of community building is never going to change, right? The tools and the vehicles for that. But I think the core of it won't.
Mm-hmm. And another question is also a bit connected with that. When I talk to founders, also investors these days, I often get the question, how do you see AI in the context of community? Because you now see so many tools popping up everywhere that like AI assisted community building, bots that give community answers, any answers. How do you kind of see that evolving? Will we even be able to have like online communities 5 years from now, or will it all just be AI generated?
Maybe you know better than I think that might be a question you could answer. I don't, maybe I'm like too old for that. Where I'm like, how does an AI authentically create an authentic connection?
I think the key question is, if you don't know if it's a human or an AI, on the other hand, what does that mean to your community experience?
And
my thesis is that community will go more offline again, because the online experience, it will be hard to verify if it's actually a human talking to me. And it's very unlikely that a human is talking to me. But yeah, I would be just curious about your take on that.
Yeah, maybe it's like you embrace it, right? You embrace everything else. So it's just like additional tools that just help make your job a little bit easier and better, right? So I still think there needs to be people that are running these programs and putting thought into these programs. But it's just, these are additional tools as what other, tools that we have at our disposal, like crowd.dev or I don't know, Notion or Discord, Slack.
Yeah.
I'm going to embrace it.
I hope you're right on that. And I agree. In the end, community will always be about building relationships. And yeah, as I said, my theory is that it's maybe just going to move offline, or will happen on other platforms that we cannot envision yet. Yeah.
Or I would love like help, right? Or even, so I love hosting in person. Like I'm forever a community builder. Like I host drink ups. I just host friend dinners. Like and I'm always curating in my mind. Like I always put together like seating lists, and I'm like, it would be really cool if in the AI, I could just put together, I'm like, hey, these are 14 people that I'm putting together for a dinner. How would you seat them? Right. Or go through my network and be like, which of these groups of people, right? Because in my mind, I just do it, right? I'm like, okay, I think like, okay, Jonathan, I would really love to introduce him to like this founder. She's building this thing, and I'm going to seat them together. Like I'm always just kind of doing that naturally, but I'm like, wow, it'd be cool if I had a tool that helps me with that. So even in person, I can think of ways that I think it would be helpful. But
I guess that's a very good take. Okay, Jana, that was it from my side. Thank you so much for joining me for that first episode. And yeah, I would say talk to you soon and see you soon in New York.
Yeah, cool. I can't wait to announce what we're going to do together.